Niin, olisi. Joo. Joo, sen verran, että tästä ei tule siis kaupan. Kylläkään se mulla on ihan talous. Mä lähdin varmaan siteraan. No pakko pelata mä vetin ihan leikkaan, että palaa. No joo, mutta se on näitä kantaa.
Okay then, for the second section I want to go through some of the work I've done with Martin Rooney, who is the best athlete I'm currently working with in Loughborough. I just want to give a little bit of background information first before I address some of the specifics of the work he did when he first arrived, and also some of the changes we have made to his programme in that intervening time to date. Okay, Martin is the British junior record holder at 400 metres and has been Olympic finalist and was this year a European medalist in Barcelona in a very tightly contested race, as I'm sure Jack will tell you about tomorrow. I myself have worked with him since the winter of 2005, when he came up to Loughborough University to study. And this process was facilitated by his previous coach, who was himself an ex-Loughborough graduate and quite a successful 800 metre runner in his time. A quick rundown of Martin's times. He is not yet quite as consistently into the 44s as he needs to be to challenge the very best in the world. But that is the aim, and that is where I have every confidence he will be come 2012. To put in context again of my own situation, I am employed by Loughborough University. Initially the post was just a coach, but now I am director of coaching, so also have responsibility for student athlete recruitment and the running of the club there itself. So although it is quite a broad-based job, it does allow me to be in effect a full-time coach. And so all the concepts that I am able to spend time developing with Martin are very much based around that idea that he is a full-time athlete and I can coach him full-time. Martin's skills were first realised, or first recognised, I should say, at the 800 metre event. As I mentioned, his own coach was a very good 800 metre runner, 147.0, I think, sometime back in the mid-60s, when that would have been quite an effective time. Having said that, he also ran the occasional 400, and as a 17-year-old, he ran 47.46. And from the basis of that, him and his coach, Mike Flint, thought, well, actually, maybe for the next 3 or 4 years, we will look at further developing you as a 400-meter runner. And then the following year was the real year that indicated to many people that maybe, in the long term, Martin's best event lay over 1 lap rather than over 2. Although that is still a debate that I have with myself and some of my coaching colleagues in the UK. He was second in the European Championships. I think it was about 46.4. But most crucially, and actually in Helsinki, he was, on the basis of his performance in the European Juniors, he was added to the 4x4 squad. And initially was brought along just to run a heat if needed. He was 4th ranked on times. Actually, he was 6th ranked on times of the squad of 6. And it was only a case that if the 400-meter runners in the individual event were either tired or made the final or whatever, that his presence would be required to run in the relay here. This he did to extremely good effect, running 44.9, both in the heat and again then in the final on the basis of that. When the relay management was impressed with his performance, they said, well, actually, this guy, no matter what his age, is going to roll a 44-second split for us. We'll use him again. Even though the Martin Rooney of 2005 was by then running 400 metres as his main event, looking at his actual training programme, it was still very, very 800 stroke endurance based. And as you can see from the times, he also ran the 800 and the 600 that year. You can see why his coach was actually very, very enthused by his prospects for the longer of the events there. If taking a slight step back, we can say 400-meter runners can be one of 2 types. They can be a speed-based 400-meter runner, or they can be an endurance-based 400-meter runner. Obviously, an extreme example of the speed-based type 400-meter runner might be Michael Johnson. It was equal to see interesting to see that Tyson Gay ran a 400. I can't remember if it was May this year, but ran 44.8 or something. Quite impressive for a debut. And he has promised or threatened to run a few more this year, with a view to making the American team for 2012 relay purposes. And then the other type, the extreme, would be Alberto Wantareng. Obviously famously won an Olympic double at 400 and 800, which was phenomenal then, and is even more astounding looking back at it now, I think, in terms of what that required of him. And there is nobody since, I think, who could realistically attempt that double. There have been some other 400, 800 type runners. Danny Evo from America was again one of those others. But I think it's probably fair to say that the most successful 400 meter runners in the main have been the more speed-based type athletes. And certainly I think if you want to approach running 43 mids or below, which obviously only 1 or 2 people have ever done in history, you have to be extremely fast to be able to handle, or to be able to have a hope of generating enough speed initially to work for that level of performance. But Martin, as we said, definitely falls into the latter category of being an endurance, an 8 to 400 stroke 800 type athlete. That's a quick outline of his PRs, or his season's best, I should say, to date. As you can see, arrived at Loughborough at the end of 2005, and in his last year as a junior improved by just over a second. That was very early in proceedings. That was actually at the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, which would have been March time. He then had a plantar fascia injury just as he was about to start competing in the summer season, so that's really prevented any further improvement of that year. 2007 was not necessarily a great developmental year for 400 metres, although as I go through the programme, we were trying lots of different things to try and make him slightly more robust and give him a better power output. Again, coming into Loughborough, he had no ability to lift weights. He had never lifted weights. He had done circuits, he had done hills in terms of general strength conditioning, but nothing really that was focused on real power development, as is quite understandable maybe for an 800 metre runner. But for him to compete over the one lap, power was where he needed to develop long term. 2008 was obviously his most successful year to date. I'll go a little bit more through that specific year later. Eventually running 44.60 and coming 6th in Beijing. The incidents, again, I'll refer to, that was probably my fault in terms of how the balance of Martin's work developed, meant he did suffer an injury in 2009, just before the 2009 season over in California in April. But has returned to some decent form this year, and we're confident he can move on and improve upon his 2008 performances in the next 2 seasons. So as I say, Martin arrived at Loughborough very much an endurance-based 800 metre runner. Huge amount of potential, especially, some good performances. The most exciting aspect to me were not necessarily what his strengths were, but the fact that he could perform at this level, or the level he was performing, with some very evident weaknesses still as part of his makeup. So if we look at the 3 components, general body conditioning, no specific strength power training, so he had never really lifted weights at all in his life other than a little bit of machine weights, and I do mean a very little bit of machine weights, and poor mechanics for a sprint event. Especially evident were his acceleration mechanics, and to an extent, that is why he had a relay split of 44.87 and an open 400 of 46.47. So 1.6 seconds difference is a lot. He still has he still has a bigger differential now than I would like, but it is much better than it used to be. So, for purposes of discussion in terms of how Martin's training has changed from when he arrived to what he does now, I've broken it down into 4 areas. Endurance, speed endurance, conditioning, strength, power, mechanics, all combined together as I hope will become evident when we talk about it, why I've grouped those together. Sorry. endurance, speed endurance, strength conditioning, power mechanics all grouped together as one, and pure speed development as the last factor. But what I would say is the development of these qualities are what I seek to do in my programming for all the athletes that I work with is very much blend or merge the different aspects that go into making up a good performer in that event. I try to blend those components throughout a year, which is probably slightly different to when I was first started coaching in the early 90s. There would probably be a big block of endurance, a big block of speed endurance, a big block of speed, and the weights program would probably follow suit. By now, I think I am trying to be much smarter in exposing athletes to different training elements that they will ultimately need when it comes to the race season at a much earlier time of the year, and trying to keep those aspects going throughout the year. They will vary in their weighting, if you like, in their volume throughout the year, but it's as much more what I call a blended program now than it previously was. As always with a new athlete, there's going to be a period of getting to know the athlete, what they're capable of, more importantly, what they're not capable of, and then trying to piece together a strategy to develop for the long term. There's no point having a strategy without knowing what the material is like you're dealing with. So from that point of view, and certainly endurance was the one thing I knew he was phenomenally good at. So a lot of the early winter work would have included sessions that he was used to doing, and indeed he had done many of these specific sessions with his former coach. And I would like to say that was a big advantage, the fact that I knew Mike Fleet, his former coach, and Mike had been up to Loughborough and brought Martin up before he actually became a student to discuss the possibility of working with me. It did make that process where I had full support of the previous coach in terms of giving me information as to what Martin was good at, etc. That made the process very, very easy to deal with comparatively to some other athletes who arrive and maybe don't have information from their previous coach, or certainly their coaches are quite happy for them to go to university but don't necessarily want to still be involved in the process of developing that athlete, even if they're not directly working with them. So, as you see, a lot of volume running, so 30 minutes of 200 meter running, 200 meter reps. Walk 200, recovery, just keep going. Not something that many of my other 400 meter runners or 400 meter hurdlers were doing at the time. And again, big extended repetition sessions. 1,000, 800, 600, 600, 333. All very similar sessions to these. All these kinds of things were work that he had done, as I say, and we kept in his program, as I knew that made him a good athlete. I knew there were aspects we needed to develop as well, but in the meantime, I didn't want to change everything, because obviously he was performing well, and so to keep his strengths made the most evident sense in terms of what I kept. While elements of track sessions such as that do still remain in his program now, a lot of that extended speed work, if you call it speed work, extended tempo work, remains in the program, but by now the majority of that will happen on a really good grass surface. And I should again stress, I am incredibly lucky at Loughborough in terms of the facilities I have. I have a really good 140 metre indoor hall, outdoor track adjacent to that, and there is still lots of good grass surfaces that we can run around on campus. Sometimes we have to watch for the odd cricket ball flying in the summer, but there is a lot of good quality grass that I do use not only during the winter, but all the way through the year. So examples of similar kind of types of session that you may have previously done on the track would be 3 minute, 2 minute, 90, 90, 60, 60 seconds with varying recoveries. And I don't think it's necessarily important I give you the specific sessions, although I'm more than happy to if that's what you want. But I think it's more the concept of why we moved this kind of work from the track onto the grass. In a word, there is much, much less shock impact going through the body if you're doing it on a good grass surface. For example, in a different context of training, if I'm doing lactate tolerance work, I could either do 2 sets of 3 300s on the track with 3 minutes recovery, or I could do 2 sets of 3 40-second runs on the grass. They might not cover quite as much ground on the grass, but the residual detrimental fatigue or stiffness factor is much, much, much reduced. And I realise that sort of again, it's going to be very cold out here to do a lot of stuff outdoors, whether it's on the track or on snow. One of the skills of a coach is going to be utilising the environment they have at their disposal. And I almost, without fail now, if we are invited to go on a training camp somewhere, I need to know that there is a good volume of training grass available, so this kind of work can continue, as I say, throughout the year. Sorry about that. By shifting the more volume-oriented running sessions onto grass, what that has allowed me to do is to put greater intensity onto the track work, and in particular in the speed endurance or lactate tolerance type work that I do. It's not necessarily that there is more of that kind of training maybe that Martin was previously used to. There's probably a little bit more, but what it has meant is he can recover much, much better because the longer volume stuff he does is done on a more friendly environment, a more friendly surface. He's still an 800 metre, he's still an endurance-based 400 metre runner. So to that end, endurance still is a part of his programme. And although he is probably not running steady state cardiovascular work as much as he previously did, again, with the aim of trying to achieve the same but in a different way. He can now do quite a bit of cardiovascular work, not running. Some he will do, but we'll also use a watt bike in a hypoxic chamber, which again, we are fortunate to have at altitude in one of the environmental chambers in Loughborough. So once or twice a week you might be doing quite an extended session or quite extended cardiovascular work. In effect at altitude, as well as doing a little bit of running. But again, taking the impact off, or taking the load off impact running enables the quality work to be at a slightly higher quality without necessarily losing the the physiological characteristics you're looking to develop. The basis of my program for 400 metres and indeed for 400 metre hurdles is not one that is particularly rocket science. It is literally based around developing the lactic tolerance system. Working anaerobic glycolysis, which is the key element for me for running good 400 metres and indeed 400 metre hurdles. Typically, I will do this work in two main phases in the year. Some years they go back to back, some years they may be slightly separated out with a different phase in the middle. The chief aim is to gradually develop the intensity of the athlete to work repetitions towards the pace they will need in a race. So to that end, the majority of the year's running work is done building towards a race pace rather than working higher than race pace and then extending it out. I know there are other concepts of 400 metre running around, and I do not claim that mine is by any means the only way of being successful. I wouldn't necessarily claim it's the best way of being successful, but I would say it is a way of being successful. And to that end, we are looking at establishing speed rhythm rather than pure speed, which sits very, very nicely with Martin's capacities as an athlete, and always sat very, very well with the quality 400 metre hurdlers who I coached previously. Again, speed rhythm for me for both events is critical. So the two phases, if I could roughly break them down. The first phase is with 3 minutes recovery in between reps. The second phase will be with 6 minutes in between repetitions. And obviously where you extend the recovery to 6 minutes, the quality of the repetition, the time of the run can improve markedly. In theory, and indeed sometimes in practice, you could design the recoveries to be very, very specific to an individual, certainly for the first phase. Looking at the peak blood lactic concentration post a repetition and but actually finding out where that would occur for an individual, because the individuals will have slightly different responses to it. Indeed, this was something I looked at, was working with a group of athletes prior to Martin, or before Martin arrived at Loughborough. The good athletes in the squad were Chris Rawlinson, Ewan Thomas was at that stage working with me, Kamel Thompson, Jamaica World Championship finalist, another low 48-second 400 metre hurdler. And looking at their blood lactate responses, we all found they had slightly different profiles. Ewan was very, very effective at this kind of work. His concentration would start dropping after 2 minutes of recovery. Chris was at about 3 minutes of recovery. Kamel was about 4 minutes of recovery. Theoretically, if you're running a person on a one-off session at this stage of the year, you could design something right, well, you run off 2 minutes, Chris, you run off 3.